Hi, my name is Ita from Benoit Language Services, and on behalf of Benoit Language Services, we'd like to thank you for your continuing partnership and for this opportunity to learn about the importance of working with an interpreter. We hope this will be a practical tool to help your work with a diverse clientele. For those of you joining us live, you may ask real-time questions throughout the presentation, and we will try our best to answer these at the end of the presentation. If you are asking questions about quotes or rates, we will gladly call or email you directly, as those kind of questions can vary nationwide. Okay. So jumping right in, did you know, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the foreign-born population in the U.S. has grown from 9.7 million in 1970 to 40 million in 2010. Now, this is part of the reason why we are saying that you need an interpreter. That jump means that in 1970, 1 in 20 U.S. residents were foreign-born. Today, that number is 1 in 8. 57 million people speak a language other than English at home. That's 1 in 5 people living in the U.S. And of those 57 million people, 25 million, or roughly almost 9% of the U.S. population, are considered having limited English proficiency, or LEP. Working with LEP clients can be a challenge as you seek to overcome language and cultural barriers. These challenges make working with an interpreter all the more necessary. So here we'll start with some helpful starters with some terms. Interpretation. Interpretation is the process of understanding and analyzing a spoken language or a sign message in the case of sign language, and re-expressing that message faithfully, accurately, and objectively in another language, taking the cultural and social context into account. So an interpreter is a person who renders the spoken word from one language to the spoken word of another. Interpreters may work in person or over the phone. We interpret meaning to things all the time, usually within the same language and culture. A language interpreter must interpret meaning from both language and culture. I'll give you an example of that in 1 second. So a translator is someone who renders written words of one language into the written word of another. Translators provide written documents. You might think, why interpret meaning at all? Why doesn't an interpreter simply just translate my words? Like I mentioned, we interpret meaning all the time, often within the same language and culture. For example, many times in our office, someone will call and ask for a Spanish translator over the phone. Well, a translator is someone who provides written words. Surely that person doesn't mean that they want someone to listen to someone speaking in Spanish, write it down, translate the written words, and type, email, or fax what is being said. When someone calls and asks for a Spanish translator over the phone, we will seamlessly interpret that to mean you need a Spanish interpreter. So LEP, or Limited English Proficiency, is what we typically call a non-English speaker. And so your non-English speaker may be referred to as an LEP client. So here are some helpful hints to help you before a meeting. If possible, determine the language need. With some languages, we may ask you for the country of origin to ensure we get you the right dialect. Now, there is a difference between a dialect and an accent. This will come with experience with various languages and cultures, but some languages do have distinct dialects, while others simply have a distinct accent. For example, Portuguese and Chinese, these languages have various dialects, while Spanish may simply have various accents. A dialect affects the sound, grammar, and vocabulary. So for example, I have a friend from London's East Side who speaks Cockney English. And believe it or not, that's considered a dialect. Sometimes, while speaking with each other, we've had a hard time understanding one another. So a mutual friend has even served as an interpreter for the both of us because I couldn't understand his Cockney English, and he had a difficult understanding my New England accent. We were both speaking the same language, English, but by contrast, my friend from Atlanta is understandable. She may sound differently than I do, but that is an accent. Her words simply sound differently. The grammar, the syntax, and many of her words, and most of her words, are still the same. So dialect is the way words are used, while an accent is the way words sound. Now, you do not have to know these differences. You just have to know that if we're asking more questions about the language, if we're asking you for the country of origin, it's because we may need that information to get you the right interpreter. So French, for example, we will ask you what is the country of origin to make sure we get you an interpreter that speaks Parisian French, French Canadian, a French from a Western African country. Those things are important when you're dealing with accuracy of language. The next point is have all relevant information ready, like names, phone numbers, claim numbers, and be prepared with your questions. If you're able to share the subject matter beforehand, please do so, especially if the case is of a sensitive nature. So if you're dealing with a crime victim or a child or end-of-life issues, it's often very helpful to let the person that you are scheduling the appointment with know over the phone so that they can relate to the interpreter and they may better prepare for issues like this. Now, during the actual interview, personal space or distance. It's usually best to take your cues from the interpreter when it comes to personal space or eye contact, etc. Cultural courtesy. Every culture has different expectations on discretion. This includes eye contact, the presence of other family members in the room or lack thereof, modesty coverings, etc. If you've never interacted with a particular culture and you have a chance to brief with the interpreter, ask them if there's anything you should know. They'll gladly tell you one or two things that may be helpful. Now, this is particular in the case of telephone conferencing. If you can, brief the interpreter. Now, briefing the interpreter can be as simple as saying, "This is about a motor vehicle accident," or anything else that would be pertinent for the interpreter to know. Allow the interpreter to introduce him or herself as the interpreter. Interpreter introductions should be brief, but would significantly put the client at ease. You may leave a detailed message through the language interpreter. If you've tried and can't get a hold of the client, leave a detailed message through the interpreter without any charge. Now, of course, obviously within the HIPAA rights, but you can do this, and many clients have found this very helpful. Be as clear and concise as possible. They say that 70% of communication is body language. And because that is lacking over the phone, we must be as clear as possible. That means that whenever possible, try to avoid thinking out loud and have your questions well thought out. As an aside, if you are on the phone with a client and you schedule a future appointment in which you will need an in-person interpreter, please do not schedule with our interpreters. Many of our interpreters cannot schedule appointments. Call our offices directly after that phone call. That way, we can review all the necessary information and your questions about rates. Now, this is probably the most helpful tip we can give. During the interview, speak directly with the client in first person. You and the client can and should communicate directly with each other as if the interpreter were not there. Direct communication avoids a lot of confusion. This keeps your client at the center of attention. If you are on site, you, the client, and the interpreter should be visible to each other, sitting in a triangular space, if possible. This also means you should make most eye contact when appropriate with your client and not the interpreter, which we understand can be a little awkward at first. A professional interpreter is trained to interpret directly or in first person to remain impartial. We call this direct communication. The he said, she said, she's saying this, he said that, please tell her this, that is what we call indirect communication. Indirect communication leads to confusion, and it's also why one should never use a friend or family member as an interpreter. They will compromise the integrity of the interview by speaking for the client or advocating. Let's look at some examples. So here's an example of indirect communication by a friend or quote-unquote an interpreter. So in this case, we have an adjuster that communicates directly with the client. Could you state your first name? The friend is interpreting indirectly. She is asking you to state your name. The witness answers, and the friend once again interprets indirectly. In this case, the interpreter is narrating the event, not rendering the speaker's actual words. A bandit held up a bank. When they captured him and asked him where he'd hidden the money, they realized he didn't speak English. The sheriff got an interpreter and put a gun to the bandit's head and said to the interpreter, "Tell him that if he doesn't tell us where the money is right now, I'll blow his brains out." Upon receiving the interpretation, the bandit becomes very animated. "I remember now. Walk 3 blocks that way. I buried the $1 million by the big tree." The sheriff leans forward, looks at the interpreter, and says, "Yeah? Well?" The interpreter replies, "He says he wants to die like a man." This is an unwanted interference, and it may seem harmless, but when it comes to friends or family, there can be a pretty thin line between interpreter and advocate, or sometimes even attorney. Moreover, messages lose their immediacy when they're transmitted through indirect speech, especially when it's involving emotional language. Language can become less forceful when narrated instead of repeated. Take, for example, a witness that says, "I didn't do it. I swear I didn't do it. Please, please believe me." Compare that to, "He says he didn't do it. He swears he didn't do it. Please, please believe him." The language can even be suggested of speaker disbelief. Let's move on to another example of indirect communication, this time by an adjuster. So here's the adjuster asking something to the client indirectly. Ask her if she went to Mrs. Smith's house. The interpreter interprets directly, and the witness answers. The interpreter does his or her job. Now the adjuster asks, was she with anyone? The message is unclear. Is she referring to Mrs. Smith or the witness? Remember, if the recordings or transcripts of an interview is unclear, the interview itself is compromised, especially in a court of law. Now let's look at an example of direct communication. The adjuster speaks directly with the witness. Did you go to Mrs. Smith's house? The interpreter interprets that. The witness answers. The interpreter also interprets, and now the adjuster asks, were you with anyone? Here, the message is clear. The adjuster is referring to the witness herself, not Mrs. Smith. Some more helpful hints during the interview. Speak naturally, not louder. Keep in mind that a lack of English does not necessarily indicate a lack of hearing or education. The only exception we would make to this is when you are on speakerphone. It's usually not the preferred method of interpreting, usually because speakerphones can be a little tricky when it comes to sound, and the interpreter can't see client reactions. But if you must use a speakerphone during a case, that is the case where you do have to speak louder and maybe not naturally. Use segments, pause after one sentence or two short ones, and try to avoid breaking up a thought. Interpreting can be mentally taxing. Remember to pause after a complete thought, not in the middle of it. So if you want to say, did you go to the store? Go ahead and ask that question. Don't ask, did you, pause, go to the store. Many times the interpretation in the target language changes the order of sentences, so breaking up a thought can actually get in the way of the interpretation. You are in control of the consultation. However, please allow the interpreter to direct the flow of communication. An interpreter may ask you to slow down or repeat if necessary. Please use simple, clear English. Whenever possible, avoid any kind of jargon, slang, idioms, acronyms, or technical terms considering the client's background. An idiom is a non-literal phrase. They basically work with pictures. Idioms are very, very culturally based. So we have to remember that many of our experiences are not universally known. Some common examples of idioms. Well, the ball is in your court. Let's not beat around the bush. Well, that's going to cost you an arm and a leg. There's no need to cry over spilled milk. Elvis has left the building. I heard it through a grapevine. Let me play devil's advocate, or speak of the devil, or she was caught red-handed. Idioms are tough, and that is why a professional interpreter is needed. An interpreter should be familiar with both cultures enough to convey the meaning. So, for example, the phrase caught red-handed. The background of that phrase is a crime-based background. It comes from an example of a homicide. A person caught in the act of a homicide, caught red-handed, meaning caught with blood on their hands. So that the phrase means that they were caught in the act. In Spanish, we would have a similar phrase, but the phrase is con las manos en la masa, which literally means with your hands in the dough. The background of that phrase comes from a baker. It means that the baker did it because you caught him with his hands in the dough. A professional interpreter would know the cultures well enough to perhaps use the idioms correctly, although they're not literal translations. But once again, they're tough, and it's why a professional interpreter is needed. Once we were given a very serious criminal case. An investigator was asking a victim questions with an interpreter present, when suddenly the witness reacted emotionally with shock and began crying. The interview was over and the case was actually lost. They asked us to listen to the audio transcripts to let them know what went wrong. When our interpreter heard it, he assessed the words were being translated, but the meaning was lost, and so the case was lost. The investigator asked a straightforward question involving a blanket. But in the culture or language that he was speaking with, it was actually an idiom, a very well-known idiom, according to our interpreter, that implied that the victim was at fault or asking to be assaulted. The interpretation in this case unintentionally re-victimized this person. Many times we use idioms to lighten the mood, but they can certainly be a nightmare. If you really want your interpreter to worry, tell a joke. Unfortunately, most jokes will get lost in translation. So instead, if you're trying to lighten the mood, find something in common to talk about. Raising toddlers, the weather, sports. Those are much more helpful things to put the client at ease than idioms or phrases. Now, during the interview, ask if the LEP client understands. In some culture, a person may be saying yes as you explain something, not meaning they understand, but because it's a polite way to stay engaged in the conversation. Everything you say will be interpreted. Please avoid private conversations within the LEP client's earshot. Please do not ask the interpreter to not say any portion of the conversation. And if you are on the phone, please be aware of what is within the client's earshot. Thinking out loud is very tough to interpret, and if the interpretation isn't given, the client will often become confused, frustrated, and wonder what is happening, and make the conversation a little bit more tense. If you feel as though the interpreter has not interpreted everything, simply ask him or her to do so. Now, continue during the interview. Please be aware that your conversations will take at least twice as long with an interpreter. Some concepts simply have no equivalent in English, and or the interpreter may have to use more words simply because of the grammar and syntax of the language. A common example we hear over the phone are addresses or proper names. The LEP client may say it in broken English, and an interpreter may ask the client to repeat multiple times or to spell it out to understand what he or she is trying to say. Please allow the interpreter to repeat everything said without interruption. And please do not rush the appointment and begin to speak faster. This will actually make the interpretation harder and thus may make the appointment longer. After the interview, remember, it's best not to ask for an interpreter's opinion. It doesn't carry any weight. The interpreter's job is to convey meaning. Under no circumstances should personal opinion color the interpretation. The interpreters are not witnesses. They are trained to be impartial and confidential. Interpreter training is not investigative training. Please do not hold the interpreter responsible for what the LEP client said or did not say. Sometimes the LEP client puts the interpreter in a very uncomfortable situation, ranging from nonsensical to downright offensive. Interpreters can only leave messages for clients with the adjuster or nurse on the line. This is in case the client picks up or has questions about his or her case. We will not be able to answer any of those questions. That's why we need you to stay on the line. Lastly, we'll have some time-saving tips. Know your departmental protocol for scheduling an interpreter. Some companies have one specific person schedule an interpreter. Others, you may call the interpreter yourself or the company yourself. Let us know if you expect the appointment to run long. Most interpreter assignments are scheduled for 2 to 3 hour minimum blocks. If you believe the appointment is going to take longer than that or is going to take all day, it's very helpful to let us know so that we can make sure the interpreter is ready for that as well. If possible, have all of your information ready whenever you see the client. It is much harder to pop in and ask a question if the interpreter has already been dismissed. But if that's the case, and it happens, call us and we can either redirect the interpreter or get someone on the line for you. Allow the interpreter to remain away from the client while not being seen. Depending on the culture, the client or interpreter may feel the need to begin small talk, which would compromise the interview as well as stall actual interpreting if a provider must interrupt an ongoing conversation. For interviews in residences, please know that safety protocols require the interpreter to stay outside the home and enter with you. If you enter the home before the interpreter arrives, please call us to let us know so we can let the interpreter know that they can go ahead and enter the home. Otherwise, the interpreter will be waiting outside the home for your arrival, and this is just a safety protocol. Whenever possible, have as much documentation in the person's native language. Do not use the internet to translate documents or statements. Always use a live interpreter or translator. A recent example I had in the last few days was the word hearing. Somebody wanted to say in Spanish that they wanted the client to attend a hearing, a legal hearing. In other words, a type of appointment where people get to state their cases or state the evidence. When they put hearing in Google Translate, the translation they got was listening. And they were about to tell the client that they needed them to attend a listening, which wouldn't have made sense. Always use a live translator or interpreter. The last thing we will say, professional interpreters do more than just repeat what you're saying. They preserve confidentiality, accuracy, and ensure culturally competent service. Using a friend or family member as an interpreter can severely compromise communication and privacy. If you arrive at an appointment and realize you need an interpreter, it's handy to have Benoit Language Services phone number on hand. This way, you may communicate with the client with an interpreter on the line. If you have any questions about effective and efficient communication with your LEP client, you may always feel free to ask your interpreter or call us with any general questions you may have. I think we may have a question on the line here about what happens if the interpreter knows the LEP person. That is actually a great question. So what happens if your interpreter knows your client? This is a big reason why we ask for the LEP clients or the non-English speaking client's name. We do give that to the interpreter ahead of time so they can let us know whether or not they know the client, because if they do know the client, it will be a conflict of interest. And so it is very important that if you have the witness or patient name, that you give that to us so that we may relay it on to the interpreter so that they may ensure a confidential appointment that is in line with HIPAA guidelines. It's a great question. Okay, I think that's it for now. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to call us at our 800 number, 800-261-5152, or look us up online. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for joining us on our live webinar, and we hope that it will lead to more effective and efficient communication in a global market. Thank you.